Hello everyone and welcome back to ASP.NET Core 1.0. My name is Steve Bishop, and in this video we're going to talk about Entity Framework Database First. Now in our last video we did a code first approach where we already had some models from earlier videos and we just created a new DB context class that we then extracted from the models and the DB context a new database. Now that works all fine and dandy if you're working on a brand new ASP.NET application. But oftentimes, and it's been pretty much my experience that the majority of the time, you will already have a database in place that has a bunch of data that you need to tap into. You need to be able to go to that database and grab the data from it and display it on your web application. So to do that, you need to utilize the database first approach. Now, I do want to say one word here, that the database first approach for ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework Core is quite a bit different than how it used to be in Entity Framework 6 and earlier. The Entity Framework 6 version and earlier used basically these TT text files that had special encoding that kind of helped build out your models in your DB context. In the new Entity Framework Core version of the database first, I think it has a lot more continuity with how you would develop a code first approach. The files that get created using database first are much more similar to a code first approach. And that means that it's not going to be this jumbled mess that you have to try to figure out. If it was done in database first, you got to go over here and look through these context files and drill down through the TT files and blah, blah, blah. You don't have to do any of that with the new database first approach. Instead, it just goes and creates that context and the models for you, which I think is absolutely fantastic. I am so happy that they did that with this version of Entity Framework. So that's great. They've made those wonderful changes, but there are a few drawbacks to Entity Framework Core at this point in time. The main one that I'm going to talk about is that it only supports Microsoft SQL Server and SQLite. It does not support right now MySQL or Oracle. And that could be a really big drawback for a lot of people. I know in many of my environments, people already have MySQL or Oracle data, and they need to be able to connect to that. And I have come up with a solution for you to go ahead and get connected to that MySQL or Oracle or even a PostgreSQL database. And that is you can utilize linked servers in the Microsoft SQL Server SQL Server database solution. Because the linked servers allow you to connect to really any type of data source that is a relational database management system. And as long as you have the drivers on that SQL server, it will allow you to connect to any of those other sources, and you set them up as a linked server. Then from there, I just create a central point database with stored procedures and views to go out and view the data from those linked servers and allow me to create, read, edit, update, that sort of stuff to the data in those linked servers. Now, I have to create that extra database that does all of those stored procedures and those views because Entity Framework needs a database to wire up to. It can't wire up to a linked server. It needs some sort of database on the SQL server to go to. So that's the approach that I currently use whenever there's an external source of, external database source that the Entity Framework will not yet wire up to. Now, this could certainly change in the next few months or years. Perhaps you're watching this video several years from when I created it and they've already got all of the support, so you can just go ahead and ignore my advice about the linked servers and use the correct class to connect to those other database sources. But for right now, that's my suggestion, that's my recommendation, is to use a linked server with a database that uses stored procedures and views to connect to that linked data server. So with that part out of the way, let's talk about the demonstration in this video now that we're several minutes into it. So the first thing you should know about this demonstration is that I do have some prerequisites or things that I've already set up before we get started with this video. The first thing is that I've installed an edition of SQL Server Developer 2016 that we're going to be working with. I am not going to be using the SQL Server Express, but you're welcome to use either version. Just understand that the licensing for the developer edition does not allow you to put it into production. It's really only for development purposes, and for demonstration purposes like what I'm doing here in this video. Now, the other reason I didn't go with SQL Server Express is because the database we're going to be working with is AdventureWorks 2016 CTP3 edition, and it only works in SQL Server Developer or Pro or Enterprise. It doesn't work on the Express edition of SQL Server. So that's why I went ahead and installed SQL Server Developer. I'm going to give you the links in the description of this video to both of these prerequisites, to the SQL Server Developer Edition and the AdventureWorks 2016. And really, these are just demonstrations that I set up, or instances that I've set up for this demonstration. You don't have to have these set up to follow along. If you already have a SQL Server out there, even 2005 or 2008, you're still going to be able to follow along with what I'm doing here. And if your database isn't the AdventureWorks database, you're also still going to be able to follow along. So don't worry. You can watch this video if you have something else set up in your environment. Now, in the last video, we covered some commands that we had to do on the NuGet Package Manager console window. And they were install package Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.SQL Server, install package Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.Tools with -pre as a parameter. And then we had install package Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.SQL Server.Design. Now that last one, the design installation, is actually for this video. We didn't really need to do that in the last video, but in this video you definitely need to have the design package installed, because that design class is what's actually going to help us with the scaffolding of the database. Also in the last video, we looked at the package.json file, and we needed to make sure that the Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.Tools 1.00 Preview 2 Final was installed both as a dependency and in the tools section. Now, if you're watching this video and you have a different version of the Entity Framework Core.Tools, you're probably going to see a different version than 1.00 Preview 2 Final. And I imagine that's probably going to happen within the next few months, as a matter of fact. So just take a look at the documentation and make sure that you're following along and you're putting the correct values in for the version of those tools based upon what's currently released and available at the time that you're watching this video. And finally, within the NuGet Package Manager console window, we're going to issue the scaffold-db context command. And we're going to pass along the connection string as well as the class that tells the scaffolding tool to go out to that particular connection string, and it's a type of SQL Server. And then we're going to specify the output dir parameter to specify the folder in our application where we want the models and the DB context to be placed. Now, speaking of DB context, what you will not find in the documents, the ASP.NET Core docs, is this -context name as part of the demonstration. I've put that in here because I like to be able to name my context. And just like we saw in the previous video, we were able to specify the context we want to work with. Here we can actually name the context we want to create. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Now, one last word about the output dir folder in this console, this command. The folder that we specify does not have to already exist. You can create it ahead of time in your application, or you can specify it here and it doesn't already exist. It'll go out and create that folder for you, so it doesn't really matter. All right, so now that we've gone this far into the video just talking about stuff, let's actually go do this stuff. So let's hop into our Visual Studio and into our ASP.NET Core documentation. So first I wanted to show you in the docs.asp.net website, you can go ahead and click on the link that says Working with Data. And from here, you're going to want to select Getting Started with ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework Core. And then from here, you'll see that we have the two options of either doing a new database or connect to an existing database, or database first. And that's what we're going to demonstrate in this video. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that link. And then if I just scroll down here, we can see there are some prerequisites here. And it's also going through a process of creating a new database in a SQL Server. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and skip past this part because the presumption is that you already have a database that's in place and you also have a project already created that you're working in. So make sure you've got a database working, you've got a project already up and running that you want to set up an entity framework for. And let's just go ahead and move on to the install entity framework section of the documentation. So the first thing you're going to want to do is go ahead and open up the Package Manager console window. So I'm going to go to my Visual Studio. I'm going to go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and then we can see Package Manager console. And that opens up the console window down here. Next, it says that we want to go ahead and install package Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.SQL Server. So I'm going to copy this command. I'm just going to do Control-C. And I'm going to go down here to our Package Manager console window, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it and hit Enter, and that's going to go ahead and install that package for us. Now, if you already did this in the previous video, it doesn't hurt to redo it here. It's not going to cause any problems to do that. It's just going to give you the latest updated files anyway. So let's go back to the documentation, and we can see that the next thing it wants us to do is to install the tools with the -pre. So I'm just going to copy that command and paste that in here in the Package Manager console. And this is installing a bunch of classes, and we can see if I click on the output, it's going through and doing basically NuGet package restore, which puts different files into our project, some DLL files, and changes our project.json file as well. We'll take a look at that project.json file here in just a bit, but I'm going to go back to my Package Manager. Where'd my console window go? There it is, Package Manager console. There we go. Okay, so the last command that we need to issue is this design class. So let's go ahead and install that. And once everything's successful and it's done restoring the packages, then we can go ahead and open up the project.json file and take a look at the tools section to make sure that the highlighted line is already in there. Now, if you did the installation, I'm pretty sure that you should already get this line of code in the tools section. But just in case, I'm going to go ahead and copy this, including that last. All right, we'll just copy that, including that last quotation mark. And I'm going to go to my project.json file, and I'm going to go to my tools, and sure enough, there it is. It's the Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.Tools with the preview to final. Now we need to also make sure that this same exact line is already existing up here, which it is. It's right here, Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.Tools. And you'll also see that the SQL Server and the design that we did the install down here in the NuGet package when we did the install package, they went up here into our dependencies. So we should be all set up then here in our dependencies and in our tools. So let's go ahead and hop back into our documentation and look at this. It says next step is to reverse engineer your model. So we can go ahead and in the Package Manager console window, we're going to run the following command to create a model from the existing database. And if we receive an error stating that the term scaffold context is not recognized as the name of commandlet, then close and reopen Visual Studio. I'm going to go ahead and just for the sake of making sure that it's done, I'm going to go ahead and save my project as it is and exit out of Visual Studio for now. And I'm going to reopen it, but I like to open up Visual Studio as administrator. So you might want to do that. Just right click on Visual Studio and go to Run as Administrator. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on Yes. Okay, so let's go ahead and reopen our project here. Now I'm going to hop over into my SQL Server Management Studio window, and this is something that you can install separately from the database, from the developer database. And really, you don't need to have SQL Server Management Studio installed in order to work with SQL Server, but it sure as heck makes it easier. But I just wanted to show you that here on my Sandbox PC, which is the developer box that I'm doing all of this with, we have a database installed called AdventureWorks DW 2016 CTP3. And in here we have several tables. We have the AdventureWorks build version, database log, and a bunch of DIM tables and fact tables and prospective buyer table. So we've got a bunch of tables already here. And just to open one up here, I'm going to do DIM promotion. And I'm going to just select it here so we can see that there is in fact some data inside of these tables. Now if I go back to my Visual Studio window and I go to the SQL Server Object Explorer, and if you don't already have the SQL Server Object Explorer window available to you, you can just go to View and then SQL Server Object Explorer. And from here, you're going to want to go to the SQL Server section, and you're going to want to add that SQL Server just by clicking on this link here. And you can browse for a local or a network database. So if your database that you're connecting to is on the network, then you're just going to want to select the network one. But the one that we're looking for is locally here, and I'm just going to select Sandbox PC. And you can also see that those other databases, the ones that are the local DBs, instead of the actual full-fledged SQL Server editions, they're also available in this connection screen. But I'm going to go ahead and select Sandbox PC, and then I would, pass in what type of authentication, and you don't really need to set up a database, but then you would just click on the Connect button, and that would then add it to the SQL Server list. Now I've already got mine added here, so I'm just going to go ahead and select it. And I'm going to drill down here to the databases section, and I'm going to click on the AdventureWorks database that I have installed. And from here, I'm going to right-click and select Properties. And now it's going to populate down here the properties of that specific database. And if I scroll down here, there's actually a connection string to that database. And if we go back to the documentation here, the reason I need that is because part of the command that we're issuing needs that connection string to the database. And you can see it's server with the server name, and then the database name, and trusted connection is true. Now the connection string we're going to use, is this one right here. I'm just going to go ahead and highlight this whole thing. So we'll just copy all of this. Just hit Control-C. And now I'm going to start that command, the scaffold-db context. So we're going to do scaffold-db context. And then it's in quotation marks. You'll see that that string is in quotation marks because it's a string. So we're going to do a paste there. And that helps because we got spaces in that connection string. Now I don't need all of this. In fact, all I really need is the data source, the initial catalog, and integrated security, because that tells it what the server name is, what the database is that I'm connecting to, and how should it connect. You could also have these other things like the connection timeout, whether or not it's supposed to be encrypted, trust server certificate, etc., etc. But I don't need any of that, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete that and put the last quotation mark there. Then if we go back to the documentation, we can see the next thing we need to pass in is that SQL Server class with the fully qualified name to that class. So I'm going to copy that and just paste that in here as well. And then the next stage is to put the output dir. This is specifying the directory that we want to export those models and the context class to. So I'm going to do output dir. And one of the things that I like to do is that if I am grabbing information from an outside database, and I'm going to create classes from that database, I really don't like putting them in my models folder. Now that's a personal preference. It's certainly up to you, and it's really kind of sometimes a good practice that all of your models, even if they come from an extraction from a database, they should probably go in your models folder. But I like to do something a little differently, and that is I like to use an entities folder. And that entities folder tells me, and I know, is something that connects to an outside data source to get those models. So I'm going to go ahead and select that for my folder. And then the last thing is you'll notice is that there is no context specified in this demonstration that they have in the documentation, like I was saying earlier in this video. So I'm going to go ahead and specify a context myself, and I'm going to call this AdventureWorks context. Okay. And now I can just go ahead and hit enter. Now, if you get this error, which I got right here the first time that I ran it, Where it says it can't find the term scaffold DB context, it's not recognized as the name of a commandlet. This is some nasty bug that is in this. I don't understand why it pops up, but I tell you what, I have had to close and reopen and reinstall the tools and everything multiple times to get this to work. So you may have to close and reopen Visual Studio multiple times, and it looks like I forgot to do it in administrator mode here. But you need to close and reopen your project multiple times in some cases in order to get the scaffold to work. So after the scaffolding is complete, we now have a new folder called Entities. This is the folder that I specified, and of course, like I said, you could be putting your models in the models folder. That's perfectly fine. But now I've got inside of my Entities folder this Adventure Works context and a bunch of models here. So we can see all the different models, and these look just like, well, some of it looks just like what we would have created ourselves. So we have our public int with a currency key. We have an I collection with virtual, because these are navigation properties going to some other collections or other tables. We have back here in our AdventureWorks context class, we have our options builder. And we can see that the options builder actually has use SQL Server, and it puts the connection string that I passed along right there into our context class. And this is different than what we did when we did the Code First edition, where we set it up in our startup class. And I didn't talk about this in the Code First video, where you could actually go to the context itself and specify the options builder in the on configuration. We could pass in right here what the connection string was. Instead, in the last video, of course, like we talked about, we went into the startup class and we added the DB context here. So there you go. Now we've wired up a existing database to our application, and now we get to actually utilize Entity Framework to go and pick apart and grab our data and display it into our application, which is what we're going to cover in the next set of videos.